Welcome back everybody to the Hybrix cultivation system. Today we're going to be talking about cover and companion crops to go with your main crop. So in this lesson we'll be going over the benefits of cover and companion crops, and we'll talk about what the difference is between those two in a minute. We'll also talk about the different types of cover and companion crops and the different benefits that both of them have. And then finally we'll talk about how and when to plant them and when to harvest them. So first, to talk about the difference between cover and companion crops. There's often some confusion around these two, and the distinction is definitely not black and white. There's a little bit of gray, a little bit of overlap between these two types of crops. The important thing to keep in mind is that the purpose of cover crops is really to keep the soil covered. And this is often done between harvests, between cycles of your regular cash crop. But it can also be grown at the same time as your cash crop in order to provide continuous soil cover even while the main crop is growing. And another way to distinguish this is that you're going to be growing your cash crop and your cover crop out of sync with each other. So you'll plant the cover crop typically close to harvest of your cash crop, and you'll harvest it at a different time and you'll replant it at a different time. Now that's distinct from the companion crop, which is typically planted at about the same time as the main cash crop, and a companion crop could even be another cash crop for you or another main crop. You might want to grow a couple different crops all at once. So companion cropping is really about figuring out which ones grow well together, which plants complement each other, because there are some plants that will actually inhibit each other's growth, while some plants that will complement each other's growth and protect each other from pests and diseases. Another thing to keep in mind is that either of these can be annuals or perennial crops. So just in case you're not familiar, a perennial is a plant that grows year-round, year after year, and doesn't die out and come back or need to be reseeded. It continues to grow year after year. So there are some perennials that work great as companion crops, and you can continue to grow them even through your cash crop cycles. And same thing with cover crops. There are some perennial cover crops that you can just continue to grow as living mulch on your soil. Now there's really about four main categories of cover crops, largely four reasons why you would want to grow a cover crop. The first one is for a green manure. Then we also have cover crops that can be nitrogen fixers. Then we have some cover crops that can be what are called biofumigants. We'll explain more about what that means. And finally, you might have cover crops that are actually intended to harvest for another purpose or for extra income. So first, to talk about the green manure cover crop. The idea of a green manure is actually to store nutrients in the plant itself. And then at some point you're going to terminate that cover crop and you're going to reincorporate it into the soil. So this is actually that concept that we talked about a few lessons back, talking about regenerative practices, where when you cut down the cover crop, you leave it on the soil as a mulch. Now some farmers or gardeners who are tilling their soil will actually work the cover crop residue back into the soil, and that's fine. And if you're doing minimal or low till, you might be disturbing the top few inches of soil, and so you could incorporate your green manure into that. Another method is actually to cover the green manure mulch with a layer of compost or a layer of worm castings or something to bury it in the soil, so you don't have to disturb that soil, but you're also going to incorporate it more quickly. If you leave it sitting on top of the soil, it may not decompose and incorporate into the soil quite as quickly. But again, the idea here is that these crops are keeping living roots in the soil and they're storing this nutrients. So if you're growing outside and you're working through a seasonal cycle. You might start a green manure in the late summer or early fall, let it grow through the winter, and then when the spring thaw comes and you're getting ready to plant your main crop, that's when you would cut this down and let it decompose and cycle those nutrients back into the soil just when they're going to be needed. Now, nitrogen-fixing cover crops serve a similar purpose. They are about nutrients, but it's slightly different in that these crops are actually fixing nitrogen as they are growing. So these nitrogen fixers tend to be legumes, and legumes have a certain type of bacteria, a nitrogen fixing bacteria, that naturally lives in symbiosis with the plant's roots. And as we mentioned before, it's actually this bacteria that's doing the nitrogen fixation. So it's pulling nitrogen out of the air, putting it into the soil while the plant is growing. And this is why nitrogen fixing plants will actually pretty much always look lush and green, even if other plants next to them are not doing so well in terms of nitrogen, or even if there's not a lot of water in the system, these plants will still typically look green because they have that nitrogen fixing component. So these are crops like beans, peas, clover, and veg. These are all leguminous crops that are typically used as cover crops. And again, you can grow these alongside your cash crop. And in fact, if you choose a species that is not growing very rapidly, that's probably the best combination because it's not going to steal other nutrients from your plant, but it's going to continue to fix nitrogen, which, as we know, is often a limiting nutrient in the soil. Now, another potential purpose of a cover crop is what we call biofumigation. So fumigation is honestly a pretty horrible practice of typically spraying some sort of chemical on the soil in order to kill off all of the soil life. This is what conventional farmers will do. Oftentimes, for example, conventional farmers who grow strawberries will do this in order to deal with nematode issues. And it is effective against getting rid of the nematodes, but it kills everything else in the soil too, and makes it very easy for pathogens to come in and for those nematodes eventually to come back. So what we're doing here with the cover crop is it's not really fumigation, but it has the same effect. So if you plant a cover crop that effectively kills off something else that you don't want there, that can be considered biofumigation. So mustard is a great example of this, and in fact most brassicas will produce some chemicals naturally that will mitigate nematodes, parasitic nematodes, from attacking other plants. A cover crop like mustard can be used to kind of clean out that soil in a sense. And another thing that this does is it prevents ryegrass from regerminating. Now, ryegrass is a commonly used cover crop, but it's something that can grow back very easily, and oftentimes when the farmer or grower doesn't want it to, it will continue to regrow. And so even though it's a great cover crop, it sometimes becomes a problem for some growers. So mustard is one way to get rid of that ryegrass. And finally, another purpose for a cover crop might be for extra income or for an extra harvest. So if you're a farmer growing commercially, it's very common to harvest a cover crop and sell that or use that for animal feed or animal bedding. Or if you are being regenerative and integrating livestock, you may bring in the livestock to terminate that cover crop by eating that cover crop down. And that accomplishes two things. It terminates the cover crop and it incorporates the animal manure into the soil. Now, another cash cover crop could also just simply be vegetables that are going to be sold in a market. So radishes are a common cover crop, and people eat radishes, so those can be sold at a farmer's market or they can be consumed yourself. And in some climates, you may even be able to grow other vegetables year-round because it's warm enough, and just simply keep a living root in the soil at all times. That's really one of the primary goals of a cover crop, is to keep a living root in the soil. So even if you're going to harvest that crop and either eat it yourself or sell it, it still has accomplished that purpose. And then some other general benefits of cover crops, we talked about these when we talked about regenerative practices, is that they add greater diversity. So one of our pillars of regenerative practices was to promote diversity of plant species and of microbes in the soil. And having a cover crop does both, especially if you are just growing one cash crop like cannabis and you don't really want to integrate in other cash crops. Then having a diverse cover crop that includes a mixture of species. There are some cover crop mixes that get up to into the teens in terms of the number of species that are mixed into them. So if you have a very diverse cover crop that can introduce that diversity element, it also improves the soil structure because the roots of the cover crop will go down into the soil and they will aerate it. And they will also create channels for water to infiltrate into the soil better. You can see here the different root lengths of some of the different common cover crop varieties, and some of them have longer roots than others. So it depends on if your cash crop also has deep roots, then you may also want a deep-rooted cover crop to make sure that that soil gets the right structure and aeration down further, deeper into the soil. Cover crops also increase microbial activity. We know that they can introduce nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and also just different microbes will grow around different species of plants because, as we know, plants are putting out exudates into the soil in order to culture and attract the microbes that they need. And different plants have different species of microbes that they work well with, and some of them have different species in common. So by bringing in different plants, you're going to introduce more diversity of microbial activity. Another thing cover crops do well is outcompete weeds, or at least they keep the ground covered so that it's not so easy for the weeds to spread out. Again, if you don't keep your soil covered, you're almost certainly going to get weeds because nature likes cover and weeds will germinate and grow in a bare soil. So having a cover crop helps to prevent that. Now there are many different species that can be used as cover crops, as you may have gotten the idea. So how do we choose which species we want to use as our cover crop? Well, it comes back to some of the things we just talked about. What is the function that you want your cover crop to achieve? Are you going for nitrogen fixation, or are you really wanting a green manure to turn back into the soil? Or are you wanting to harvest this cover crop for animal feed? Well, if you're harvesting for animal feed, you're probably going to want some sort of grass that can be turned into hay, versus if you're really looking for nitrogen fixation, then you're going to want a leguminous species. So you have to consider that function. Also consider the growth cycle of the species of cover crops. So there's a common mix, 3-species mix of oats, peas, and vetch. And in my experience, this cover crop grows relatively tall relatively quickly within just a matter of 6 weeks or so. You can have a mature cover crop that's waist high versus planting a largely clover cover crop blend. Clovers will not grow as quickly and they can be used for a longer period as ground cover before they need to be trimmed back. You'll also want to consider the potential invasiveness of a species, especially in your particular climate. As we know, different plants will grow better in different soil types and in different climates, and take the idea of invasiveness with a grain of salt. You'll find lots of information on the internet saying, oh, this species is invasive, this one is invasive. Invasive really just means whether or not it is harmful to what you're trying to accomplish. So if there's a cover crop species that grows really quickly and spreads very easily, it could be invasive. But if it's a clover and it's not going to be detrimental if it grows widely, then that's okay. Whereas on the other hand, if some ryegrass can grow very quickly and it can actually potentially steal nutrients from other crops, and so that can potentially become invasive. But again, it all depends on what your purposes are. Now there are some common cover crop mixes that are sold on the market so that you don't have to try and determine which species will go well together. For example, as we've mentioned before, Build-A-Soil makes a 12 species cover crop blend that is largely consists of clovers, so it has really great diversity and it's really good for continuous cover for your soil. Versus again, I mentioned that combination of field peas, oats, and veg is just a 3 species blend. It's better for growing in fields, and I believe Johnny's Seeds sells that blend, or possibly Arbico Organics. So you can look at some of these different sources and see what cover crop species blend might work best for you. So just to highlight a few cover crop species that are especially beneficial, we highly recommend clover species for reasons stated. They don't grow quite as quickly, they tend to stay more low to the ground, and so they make a great, what we call living mulch. In other words, you don't necessarily have to have like a hay or a straw mulch to keep your soil covered. You can have living roots in your soil, which is even better. They're not going to outcompete your main cover crop, they're not going to steal nutrients, and they're simultaneously going to fix nitrogen and actually feed that nitrogen to your main crop. Alfalfa is another really great cover crop species for a number of reasons. Alfalfa can actually be grown and harvested as an animal feed. But it also fixes nitrogen, so it can be grown alongside your main crop. Now, alfalfa does grow a little bit faster than clover, so you'll want to make sure to trim it back frequently and reincorporate it into the soil, because it does do well at accumulating certain essential nutrients like iron, magnesium, phosphorus, and potassium. You've got a lot of nutrient provision potential with alfalfa. Alfalfa is also a really good soil aerator. So the big question for a lot of people is, when do I plant this cover crop? So if you're growing outdoors and following kind of a normal seasonal cycle, you'll typically plant a cover crop sometime in the fall. You could plant it right before harvest, but a lot of farmers will wait until after harvest, especially if in your climate you have a winter rainy season. You'll want to have some rain immediately after seeding a cover crop to help it germinate. If you don't have rain and that cover crop is delayed to germinate, you risk those seeds being eaten by birds. I've experienced this before. And also, if you live in a colder climate, it may get too cold for that cover crop to germinate if you don't water it or have rain quickly enough before it gets too cold. However, besides just following this seasonal planting of cover crops, you can also grow a cover crop, as we've mentioned, throughout the year, throughout your growing cycle. And so my favorite time to plant a cover crop is just as I'm getting my seedlings started. So that gives me, typically if I get my seedlings started, they take 4 weeks or so before they're ready to transplant into the main soil, and that gives the cover crop about 4 weeks to grow, and typically it gets pretty tall by then, and so at that point I can cut it back, cut it down, incorporate it into the soil, or really just lay it on top of the soil, cover it with a layer of worm castings or compost, and do the transplanting right into the middle of that cover crop residue, and then reseed another cover crop immediately after that, so that this cover crop starts to grow alongside my main cannabis plant. And typically I'll use that 12 species, largely clover, blend from Build-A-Soil. Another thing to note when you're seeding cover crops is that you can really just broadcast the seeds across the top of your soil. There's no need to plant them individually. You can just throw a bunch of seeds out there and let them germinate. Make sure that you seed densely enough though that you will cover all of your soil. So I believe you want about a tablespoon or so per square foot of soil. And then it's best practice to cover that with a light layer of either compost or worm castings, or just more of your same soil mix. Give it about 1/4 to 1/2 of an inch cover so that the seeds are protected from the sun, and when you water your soil, they will get totally surrounded in water, so they'll germinate faster. And this here just shows an example of terminating cover crop. This is in my small garden, just simply using a scissors to cut down that cover crop, and then we're going to spread it as mulch over the soil and plant right into it. Now, on to companion plants. So companion plants, in a little slightly different way than cover crops, serve a number of different functions. They can often be about pest deterrents. So there are certain plants that will deter or repel common pests of your main cash crop. Another thing companion plants can do is provide some sort of boost in growth, or even a boost in terpene or oil production, or really just overall yield of the compounds that you want in your main cash crop. They also are another way to introduce diversity into your farm or garden. Again, one of our main objectives here is to introduce diversity, so this is where companion plants can really come in. And then there are some other minor functions of various companion plants, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. So here's a really great, really common example of companion crops that work really well together. This is called the Three Sisters. It's a combination of corn, beans, and squash. This was discovered by Native Americans hundreds of years ago, and this combination was partly about nutrition. So these three crops together actually create a very balanced diet. But these three crops also have functions that support each other. So corn actually supports the growth of beans by providing a tall, strong, rigid stalk for the beans to grow on. As you know, if you've grown beans before, they're more like vines, and they like to weave their way up some sort of rigid structure. And also, if there wasn't that structure there, they would be overcome by the squash, because as you may know, squash just grows very profusely and will totally take over. The beans provide nitrogen fixation, largely for the corn and for the squash, which both need copious amounts of nitrogen, corn especially. And then the squash provides really good shade for both the corn and the beans, and actually really for all three plants. The shade keeps the soil cool, and it prevents weeds from sprouting. So you can see how all three of these have a really great symbiotic relationship with each other, and that makes them good companion plants. So now we're going to talk about some species that are commonly companion plants with cannabis and with tomatoes. The interesting thing is that the ideal companion plants for cannabis and tomatoes are almost exactly identical. As you may have heard, there's a lot of similarities between cannabis and tomatoes, and companion plants are one of those areas. Interestingly, corn is not really a good companion plant for cannabis or tomatoes. There are actually certain plants that will inhibit each other's growth, and we'll touch on that briefly at the end, but first let's talk about some good companion plants. So, the first one that comes up is basil. Basil is a great deterrent for certain pests like aphids, mosquitoes, and tomato hornworms. The other great thing that basil does is it boosts terpene production. So if you're growing cannabis, terpenes are important. Basil is going to help with this. Another great companion crop for cannabis or tomatoes is lemon balm or peppermint. Both of these look and act very similar, so we put them together here. These are both really great at repelling mosquitoes, but possibly more importantly, gnats. So if you're worried about fungus gnats, some lemon balm or some peppermint could be really good for you. They also attract beneficial pollinators. And as a herb, they also actually do help with essential oil production. Now, one thing to be warned of is that they grow profusely, so they can take over. So be careful if you plant these outside because they can spread all over the place. If you're planting them in pots or raised beds where you can control things a little bit better, it's not so bad if they spread everywhere. Now, garlic is another great companion plant. Garlic deters a lot of different pests, but it's especially good for deterring spider mites and aphids, two of the biggest culprits for both tomatoes and cannabis. The other thing you can do with garlic is crush it up and make it into a really great insecticidal spray. So if you do get an insect infestation, you have a natural way to combat that. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that garlic does take a long time to grow, typically about 9 months to reach maturity, so you'll want to plan accordingly, and perhaps it's actually going to could potentially end up growing for over a couple different cycles of your cannabis, but this is not a problem. Just make sure that you plan for that. Another great thing to plant along with your cannabis or your tomatoes is flowers. You'll notice we have some common themes here: herbs and flowers. In fact, having herbs and flowers planted together, they will enhance each other's terpene and oil production. So, chamomile also boosts oil production. It is also a great accumulator of phosphorus, sulfur, and calcium. So, once your chamomile has reached a certain size, you can cut it down and incorporate it into the soil as well and return those elements to the soil. It's also just a generally a great pest deterrent. It deters a lot of different flying pests, and it increases something called turgor, which has to do essentially with the structure and the strength of the stems of your plants. So chamomile is going to help your plants, your cannabis or your tomato plants, to grow stronger and have more support. Golden yarrow is a perennial flower, and it's great to grow along the edge of your garden because it does have a really profuse root structure, and so you don't want that root structure competing with your tomatoes or your cannabis or your other plants. So that's why it's good to grow around the edge. But it is also a perennial plant, so meaning you can continue to grow it. You don't have to reseed it over and over again. It will just continue to be there. It can act as a really great pest deterrent, and it also attracts beneficial predators, especially birds that will eat a lot of the pests that you worry about. Now, you may be thinking, well, deterring pests, attracting birds, this kind of sounds more like something for an outdoor context. And yes, this is partially true. This is going to probably be a little more effective outdoors. However, unless you have really, really tight protocols for keeping things out of your indoor grow or out of your greenhouse, you're going to get organisms that are moving between your greenhouse or your indoor grow and outside. So this can be a good backup plan in case your containment protocols fail. You have another safeguard here, which is having a companion plant that will prevent those pests and attract and retain beneficials. And in fact, as you'll find out in the next lesson, you're going to want to introduce some beneficials even into your indoor grow. And so having the right habitat for those is also important. And similar to golden yarrow, red yarrow is another one for pretty much similar reasons. It will also boost oil production, and it will attract beneficials like pollinators. Now you may be thinking, well, if I'm growing cannabis, I don't want my cannabis pollinated. I want to weed out any males and just keep the females. And that's okay. One thing to keep in mind is that sometimes you want to have functions in your garden that don't necessarily have a direct benefit for you or your plants, but they benefit the broader ecosystem. And so by boosting pollinators, you're going to boost the overall support of your ecosystem and just make everything more healthy. And that will come back to you. It may not be really readily apparent as to how that will come back and benefit you. But remember, we're working with a complex ecosystem here with many different connections. We can't always predict how these things are going to affect each other, but we know that pollinators are good for the ecosystem. And so if we can do anything to attract and boost pollinators, we should. Cilantro is another great, delicious plant that you can use for making salsa, make some really great dishes. And again, it also boosts soil production, it deters aphids and spider mites, and it attracts beneficial predators. So you're probably starting to see a theme here. The reason why we present all these different options for you is some people don't like cilantro. I know that it's one of those things that either you love it or you hate it, but you might be a fan of basil instead, so we want to give you some different options here. Lavender is another great flower to grow that, again, boosts oil production, and it deters a lot of different pests, but is most notable because it deters rats and mice. So if you have any kind of problem wherever you are with rats and mice and other small mammals, lavender can be a great deterrent for those. And it is great for beneficial predators and for pollinators. And it just smells really amazing too. Marigold is another one that boosts oil production, deters nematode pests specifically. So if you're having a problem with nematodes or you're worried about nematodes, marigold could be a good companion plant for you. And it specifically, because it's a flower, attracts nectar-eating beneficials. Alright, and finally, just to touch on, some plants are not good as companions. So we've seen how certain plants, especially with cannabis and with tomatoes, we want generally flowers and other herbs, but there are some plants that we don't want to plant alongside those. So a few examples here, fennel and broccoli. Both of these secrete compounds that will actually hinder the growth of your tomatoes or of your cannabis, as you can see by the picture here. Same thing with cabbage, and as I mentioned earlier, corn and dill. Actually, all of these are inhibitors of tomato growth and of cannabis growth. Now, you may have heard dill mentioned as a good companion plant for cannabis because of it's an attractor of beneficial insects. So in this case, you may just want to plant your dill in a separate pot so it's not in the same soil, and maybe keep it a little bit further away from your cannabis so that it doesn't have a direct effect on your cannabis, but it can still have that beneficial effect for the predators. So as you can see, there's a little bit of nuance to this. You want to do your research, make sure that you've got the right plants growing together. But overall, companion planting can be a really great strategy for increasing your diversity and for boosting your production of things like terpenes and essential oils, and even boosting the yield of your main cash crop, and again, boosting the overall diversity, which is essential for having a truly regenerative high-bricks garden or farm. All right, so that's our lesson for today. Next week, we're going to start talking about integrating both what we call micro and macro livestock. So first we integrated companion plants and cover crops. Now we're going to introduce more diversity in the form of living, moving organisms, animals, and insects. So we'll see you next week.